Thank you, Chris. It's an honor to speak to you this evening on this very important topic. I've been speaking on this for quite a few years now, and now that I'm retired, I dedicate most of my time to preparing lectures and inviting other speakers on these topics as well to speak at our forum. This particular topic is very important. I speak to a lot of different skeptics who can't understand what I believe and why I believe it. I mean, my background is in science. How can you believe that evolution is not true? Well, I looked at the science behind it, and it's not very good. In fact, you could say it's non-existent. There recently was a book put out by CMI called Evolution's Achilles Heels. And this is written by 9 scientists. These are all creation scientists who have a PhD degree in a scientific discipline, and they've written on their discipline about the discipline and explained why creation is true and why the science behind evolution just doesn't exist. And I'm sure that the book, if it's not available here, will be available soon. It's one that you're going to look at. A lot of good details in it. And what I find interesting about those scientists is the fact that most of them used to believe that evolution was a fact, that evolution was true. And when they really looked into it, when they were challenged by either students or colleagues, they saw that science just does not support evolution at all. I've spoken on this particular topic at a number of different places, including in Eastern Europe, where people have been brought up under the communist system, and of course evolution was fit right into their cultural and worldview. And so I've modified it somewhat for this audience, and I'm going to go through this here. What I'm going to cover, first of all, before I go into the 4 fatal flaws, and there are more flaws than just these 4 that I'm going to discuss tonight, but I want to go into them a little deeper, these particular 4, so you can see that science just does not support this theory, so-called. But to do that, we need to make sure that we have the right understanding of the meaning of some of these key words. First of all, what do we mean by evolution? And I'm going to get into that in a minute. And then, what is science? I want to explain those 2 concepts very quickly and then go into the flaws. So first of all, what do we mean by evolution? And if you read books by the secular evolutionists, you'll find they use 5 different terms quite frequently. One is artificial selection. We all know, yes, that works. That has worked the 18th, 19th, 20th century. And Darwin based some of his theory on the fact that artificial selection, we have evidence for that. Sometimes they use the word evolution very loosely to say, well, any change, that's evolution. And then microevolution, that is really, that's an unfortunate choice of words, because what it really is an adaptation to the environment that the living organism finds itself in. The 4th one is what we call macroevolution, and that's really Darwinian evolution. And that's, when I use the term evolution from here on out, that's what I mean. There is no science behind macroevolution, Darwinian evolution. And the 5th one is called molecular evolution, and that talks about the origin of life. Chris mentioned that as well. Sometimes evolutionists don't consider the origin of life as part of evolution, but you got to get this chain going. How do you get it going? If you got nothing living to start with, how do you get the complex living organisms out of that? So the first 3, we agree, they've been observed. What we have a problem with, though, is the secular evolutions, they show us examples of those 3 and then say, well, those are true, so therefore macroevolution is happening too. It's a giant leap of faith, and there's no evidence for that, as you'll see. And then the 5th one, there's a biogenetic law which says you can't have life come from a non-life. And there is no evidence, scientific evidence for that. And you know the story of evolution. I'm not going to go through that. This is put together by a secular science group, and you'll notice they start with the evolution coming from the beginning of the universe, going to beginning of life, and then beginning of complex living organisms, of which we supposedly are the end product of that. So then, question of what's science? Well, science is known to be the search for truth, but what people don't realize is that science is limited to certain areas of truth. It can't talk about emotions or love or other things like that. It can't define that. But the other thing we have to understand in science, you all know about the scientific method where you come up with a theory, you run experiments to either prove or disprove that theory, and if your theory is not proven, you make some modification and try and prove that that is true. That's the scientific method. The other one that we have to use in this case is the origin science. In other words, we can't go back in time and look at creation. If evolution is true, we can't go back in time and look at the creation of the universe, the Big Bang or anything like that. We just can't go back in time and do that. So we have to look at the evidence that was left here to determine how things probably started. And the best way to think about that is this here diagram. If you're looking at something in the present, you're running an experiment, repeatable, observable, that's science. However, if it's not repeatable, history is not repeatable, obviously, then that's history. But there is an eyewitness to record what happened. If there is no eyewitness and it's not repeatable, it happened in the past, that's a belief system. And I would submit that both evolution and creation are belief systems. So the question remains, well, where does the evidence tell us how things happen? So now let's look at these four fatal flaws in the theory, so-called theory of evolution. And I'm going to cover these four tonight, but there's obviously others as well that we could consider. First of all, macroevolution has never been observed. Macroevolution is really, you've heard it, molecules to man, common descent from one living organism, everything descended from that. Go to you through the zoo, a nice phrase that some people use, but it's the start of a living organism and going all the way up to a much more complex living organism, and humans supposedly being the most complex of all. So when we talk about evolution, that's what we have not observed, and we don't have scientific evidence for that. So what do we mean by microevolution? And I think a better term to use actually is adaptation. When living organisms are put in certain environments, they can adapt to their environment. And we all agree, creation scientists and secular scientists all agree that happens. There's evidence for that. And some of the best evidence is Darwin's finches. That's microevolution. And that is, all those 13 species of finches, yes, there's changes in the environment. Some of those living organisms change to adapt to that environment. But the result, it's still finches. It hasn't gone to any other kind of bird, hasn't gone to reptiles or anything like that. It's still finches. The problem is secular evolutionists say, look, that's evolution happening in action. Therefore, macroevolution happens. Well, no. That's a huge leap of faith which has never been shown to be true. So the other thing we'll see is that all observed changes in these mechanisms or in these living organisms involves sorting and loss of genetic information. Our bodies is going through mutations. We're not getting any healthier over time, generation to generation. We're losing information. We're not adding information. Here's an example of that. Dobzhansky ran some experiments on fruit flies. Fruit flies multiply very fast. So you can go through thousands of generations of fruit flies and irradiate them and see what kind of changes happen over time. Well, it turns, yes, there are changes happening, but all of those changes result on organisms that are worse off than we started with. First of all, they're irradiated. There's mutations in them. There's information loss. There are no beneficial changes that result in a more complex living organism that can grow in complexity. It just doesn't happen. In fact, you see these four-winged fruit flies. Well, one of those pairs of wings is useless. Can't use it at all. So it's not really evolution. It's microevolution, and it's probably best called devolution. It's devolving, not evolving. A quote by an evolutionist, Lewin. He went to a conference back in Chicago and made this comment. And his colleagues, of course, were horrified for him to say this, but he says, the mechanisms underlying microevolution cannot be extrapolated to explain the phenomena of macroevolution. You can't say microevolution is happening, therefore macroevolution can happen too, because there is no evidence for that. And he gave a very resounding no to that. We cannot say that microevolution results in macroevolution. Now, there's four scientists I'm going to cover here very quickly that have written books studying microevolution and mutations and natural selection. I find this interesting book by Lee Spetner. It's called Not by Chance. He looked at the microevolution of living organisms. And by the way, he's not a believer. He's an Israeli scientist, and he has no axe to grind in terms of creation. He ran this experiment, and he said all point mutations that have been studied on a molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. And this is what creation scientists have been saying all along. We are devolving. We're losing information in our living organisms. So random chance and mutations and natural selection, they cannot explain macroevolution at all. And moreover, he says in his book, if mutations are non-random and or the environment can stimulate adaptive mutations, the paradigm of Darwinian evolution, which has dominated the biological sciences for close to 150 years, must be replaced. Here's a secular scientist and an Israeli biologist. He knows what he's talking about. He said there is no evidence that this has happened or even can happen. Jerry Bergman, who has spoken here a number of times at the creation conferences, he's a creation scientist. He's written articles and books, and he's a biologist, on mutations and information. He says DNA, RNA mutation can't provide significant new levels of information. Again, you can't add information to get more complex living organisms. It just doesn't happen. There's no good example of a beneficial information-gaining mutation. Very few mutations are beneficial, less than 0.01%. Thousands of bad mutations exist. Most mutations are bad. Here's another scientist, John Sanford. He wrote a book called Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. Again, here's an example of somebody who taught at Cornell University. He's a biologist. He's done a lot of inventions, written patents, and students challenged him. He believed in evolution. Students challenged him, and after a few years, he eventually came to belief and said, no, that doesn't work. He never questioned evolution before. He just thought it was true because all his professors told him it was true. So the reality is that mutations are mostly harmful. Cancer is a harmful mutation, obviously. Random mutations destroy information. Selection can't eliminate all the bad mutations. They are propagated in our genome. Good mutations are mostly unselectable. And he's done a study on that. And here's one of the charts that he demonstrates that the genome, our human genome, is deteriorating. Most mutations are neutral or bad. And that's the curve to your left there. That's the distribution of the mutations. Most of them are bad, that big curve, that part of the bell looks like a bell-shaped curve, or bad. And then the ones on the little rectangle on the right, at the very bottom, is good mutations. There are essentially 0 good mutations, and it turns out the chance of selecting them, through a natural selection process is almost 0. So he has shown through experimentation that it can't happen. And this agrees with Spettner, who made the same conclusion. So there's no form of selection that can stop genetic deterioration. It can only slow it down. Living organisms show a process of devolution called genetic entropy. So mutation accumulation causes genomic deterioration. Our genome is running down. And so the primary axiom of the theory of evolution is impossible to achieve, is his conclusion. And then the fourth one is by Lynn Margulis, who is also a biologist. She's done some study of this. Now, she believes in evolution. She's an atheist. However, she realizes that we have no evidence, evolutionists have no evidence for the truth of the theory of evolution. She says, many biologists claim they know for sure that random mutation, purposeless chance, is the source of inherited variation that generates new species of life. She says, no, it can't happen. It just does not happen. New mutations just don't create new species. So in summary, looking at what those 4 scientists have found, they're all scientists with doctorate degrees, biologists, they know of where they speak. They say, well, yes, there are changes. They're adaptive. They're not random mutations. They adapt to the environment, irrespective of the environment that they're in. But they're controlled by the built-in cellular processes in the genome, in the living organism. They're not, the cells react to the environment that they find themselves living in. And it leads to limited genetic and phenotypic changes. Adaptive mutation is not a mechanism for evolution, but for adaptation. And that's microevolution. Yes, microevolution is happening. And all these scientists agree on that. We agree that as creation science, we agree that. Macroevolution assumes production of new information. And that is something we just don't see. You can't just select from something that is not there. If new information not being added to that living organism, you don't have it to select. So we see mutational deterioration of the genome. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. So basically the conclusion is it just can't happen. From a biological point of view, from the information point of view, nothing is there that you can select from and produce a more complex living organism because you're losing information. Second, there's no transitional fossils. People think they found transitional fossils, but the fossils they find, they place in the supposed macroevolution mechanism. Because say if you went from a simple living organism to a much more complex, well, we must be able to find something in between that is sort of halfway complex. Well, yeah, you do, but you have no evidence that it fits where they say it fits. They're making up a story. But here's some physical evidence that we have. In some cases, we see inverted fossil orders. In other words, you see fossils of marine life on the top of mountains. Well, according to secular geologists, they should be at the bottom, and the more complex ones should be at the top of the geological column. And they can't explain the phenomena here that we see: the Cambrian explosion, living fossils, polystrate fossils, and the lack of empirical evidence for transitions. All the ones that they found, they said, well, these are examples of transitions between different living organisms. Well, the Arctopteryx, found in China, it turned out not to be a transition between a bird and a reptile, but actually the fossil of a bird. And all secular scientists even agree now that is not really a true transition. Jonathan Wells wrote a nice book called Icons of Evolution. He's from the Discovery Institute here in Seattle. And he explained that whale evolution, as the secular scientists explain it, and horse evolution, he has totally debunked both of those. He said the evidence doesn't support it at all. And then next month, Chris is going to speak on this last one here, no credible ape to human fossil identified. So let me just go through a few of these. First of all, the Cambrian explosion. This is the secular column here of the geological column with their supposed dates. And you'll see at the very bottom you have the Cambrian layer where you expect to find most of the early life. Well, it turns out that's not what you find there. In fact, scientists find what it turns out to be most of the known phyla of today. There are examples of those phyla at that bottom layer in the Cambrian. And only soft-bodied organisms like worms found in the Precambrian, but there's no path from the Precambrian to the Cambrian. The number of species fossilized in the higher layers decreases, in fact, with each higher layer. It doesn't increase, which is what you would expect from evolution. There's a lot more to this story than I've covered here. In fact, there's a book, Darwin's Doubt, written by Steve Meyer, which explains this in a lot of detail. So this cannot be explained by secular scientists. In fact, here's some comments by some of the secular scientists who have written textbooks. Fatuma here, he's written a number of textbooks. He says, consider likely that all the animal phyla became distinct, not extinct, distinct before or during the Cambrian, for they all appear fully formed without intermediates connecting one phylum to another. So even the secular scientists agree that the Cambrian layer of fossils cannot be explained through evolution. Simpson, another quote from an evolutionist. Nearly all categories above the level of family appear in the record suddenly and are not led up to by known, gradual, completely continuous transitional sequences. So here's two secular scientists agreeing that the evidence of what should be in the Cambrian layers is just not there, is not found there. And then we have the example of living fossils. I give you just two here. Coelacanth fish. It was said because they have found fossils of that fish in the early 1900s, and they said, well, that fish is extinct. We haven't seen that fish at all. And moreover, it's 70 million years old, and it died out. Well, guess what? Fishermen in 1938 found a live fish around the Cape of South Africa. And it was very much alive. When you can compare the body form with that of the fossil, they're very much alike. So not only is it not dead, it's still alive, and it hasn't changed a whole lot. If that was really 70 million years old and evolution was occurring, you'd expect it to change a whole lot. Well, there are no changes seen. Even a 25 million year old termite fossil found in amber. Darwin, in his day, of course, he wrote, The Origin of Species. He predicted that fossils would show changes in the fossil record over the years. He knew when he wrote the book Origin of Species, he didn't have the evidence to prove that evolution is true. In fact, if any of these categories, he had no proof at all, any of these four. So now they found the termites are identical to the termites living today. The fossil is very similar. Again, you'd expect to see a lot of changes over 25 years. You don't see that. Another thing we see today is polystrate fossils. Polystrate fossils are ones that you see evidence of a fossil going through multiple layers of the geological column. Now, if those columns were laid down slowly over millions of years, you wouldn't expect to see this fossil in those layers. Well, what do we see at Mount St. Helens? We see evidence of trees, the trunks of trees, embedded in layers of the geological column. And so this can be explained by catastrophe but it cannot be explained by uniformitarianism. So it supports the creation model. And you can see a lot of examples of that at Mount St. Helens. Then the last category is fossils of so-called human precursors. And in another lecture, I cover these in more detail, but I don't have time to go through them here. Yes, people have found fossils which look like they may have some connection with humans, or more likely have some connection with apes and chimpanzees. Well, these were all put in textbooks and said, here's proof that evolution is true through the human fossil record. Within 50 years or less, all of these have been debunked. And even secular scientists, secular paleontologists agree that these are just not credible fossil records of a transition from some ape-like creature to a human being. Piltdown Man, for example, it's proven to be a hoax. Some guy who really wanted to be famous, he put together a human jaw and an ape head and made it look like they were one, and said, well, that's that transition between an ape-like creature and a human, and it's not. Nebraska Man, you should see some of the pictures of that. It was based on an artist's conception of the tooth of an extinct pig. And then lastly, Lucy, which was supposedly the best evidence for a fossil at all, is just not valid. And here basically is the reason why. Discovered in 1974, supposedly 3.5 million years ago. The evidence based on the arm-leg ratio, the apes, they have long arms, and so the ratio of their arm length to their leg length is different from a human. And so they found a skeleton here, which they said that ratio is somewhere in between what it is for an ape-like creature and a human. And therefore, it's probably a transitional fossil. However, they did not take into consideration 3 other observations: that the fingers are long and curved, which is ideal for climbing, which you'd expect apes and chimpanzees have. Shoulder blade looks like that of a gorilla. The brain size of a chimpanzee. They didn't take that into consideration. Checking the facts further, we find, well, the leg bone in that skeleton was actually broken in 2 places. Therefore, the ratio they came up with is not valid. So it can't be used as evidence of evolution of this ape-like creature. The hip pelvis was incomplete and reshaped to make it look as if it walked upright. The knee joint was found over 1 mile away and 200 feet deeper in the layers of rock than the rest of the skeleton. So this wasn't even the skeleton, the complete skeleton of one living organism. So the fossil remains of 2 different creatures fitted to form a make-believe creatures. So it was starting with this 40% skeleton. How did they reconstruct it? Well, there was a movie put together and shown on PBS which showed how they did it. And they put this in a museum, the St. Louis Museum. Notice that this character on the right has a lot of hair. How do they know how much hair that had? Because fossils don't preserve hair. All they can do is guess. So an artist said, well, if it's a transitional fossil between an ape-like creature, which has a lot of hair, and a human, which most of us don't have a lot of hair, then I must have something in between. And so that's what it shows there. The pelvis, they fixed that by some magic. And, power saw, which I won't show here, but they showed how they doctored the pelvis to make it look like it could have walked upright. So it turns out it's a make-believe creature. It's not a valid transitional fossil at all. Notice that the pensive look in that ape face. How would they know what he looked like back then? That's just an artist's conception. It's not real. Even Lord Zuckerman, who believes in evolution, had this to say. Said, how can that be without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation? All we got is this so-called Lucy fossil, which isn't even real, and every other specimen it just doesn't show this transition at all. Two other scientists who are, again, these are evolutionists speaking. These are honest evolutionists. Watson says, the fossils that decorate our family tree are so scarce that there are still more scientists than specimens. The remarkable fact is that all the physical evidence we have for human evolution can still be placed with room to spare inside a single coffin. In other words, they're saying we really don't have the evidence. And Stephen Gould, the well-known evolutionist again, said there's a glaring deficiency in the whole story. We just don't have the evidence. And so it comes down to, as this scientist says, secular reasoning. Now, Duane Gish was a creationist, well-known creationist with ICR, doctorate in biology, and he studied fossils very, very carefully. And he wrote two books, one called Evolutions, the Fossils Say No, and then a second one 10 years later, which is said, Evolution, the Fossils Still Say No. So he says in the preceding chapters of his book, we have cited example after example of failure to find transitional forms where evolutionary theory predicts such forms should have been found. The examples cited in this book are in no way exceptions, but serve to illustrate what is characteristic of the fossil record. He doesn't find any credible transitional fossils. Darwin, as I said, back in 1859 when he wrote the book Origin of Species, he admitted, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. So he understood that he didn't have the evidence, but he depended on the fact of scientists, paleontologists finding the evidence later on. And as Paul Moody writes later on, in a recent standard textbook, fossil forms intermediate between large subdivision classifications such as orders and classes are seldom found, and in parentheses, actually never found. So again, even secular scientists agree we don't have the evidence for this. And those are some more quotes from other evolutionists. The third item I want to say is a big flaw in evolution. And as Chris mentioned before, scientists, evolution like to say, well, the beginning of life is not part of the evolution story. Well, then what is? Self-directed panspermia, as Dr. Crick believes, from outer space, well, all that does is move the problem to outer space someplace. Life still has to start someplace. And if you look at closely, you'll see that it's really impossible to transmit any kind of a living organism from outer space. It just can't happen, but that's another story. Spontaneous generation has been known by scientists to be impossible. An experiment was run by Pasteur as late as 1860, where he showed you just can't start life from non-living material. It's impossible. That's the law of biogenesis. It has never been falsified. Nobody has shown how life can start from non-life. Moreover, if you look at more complex life, there's bacteria, single-cell bacteria, which is fairly simple, but any life form with multiple cells, which we'll look at here, there is no way it could happen if you look at the mathematical probability of random mutations and natural selection. And I'm going to show you this in the next slide here. And that's the smallest bacteria known, 482 genes, 600 types of proteins, 580,000 DNA base pairs. That's a lot of base pairs in a simple bacteria. And I'll show you some of the mathematical probability calculations scientists have done, but the probability of forming that simple bacteria by chance through mutations and natural selection is mathematically impossible. The human genome, moreover, has 3 billion base pairs. So if the bacteria is impossible, how could a human genome start by chance? And we have to excuse Darwin, because obviously he didn't know about the cell structure, he didn't know the complexity, he didn't have the electron microscope to look into that. He just thought it was a blob, and it's just a simple blob, but turns out it's much, much more complex than that. So how did the evolutionists get around this? And I would submit that if you pose these four challenges to the theory of evolution to evolutionists, they don't have an answer. They have no answer for any four of these. First of all, their presuppositions are wrong starting out with. Evolution presupposition, they say everything in the universe consists of only two material things, and that is matter, mass, and energy. Matter, everything can be explained in terms of mass and energy. Your brain waves are nothing more than your mass and the energy of the mass in your brain. So if that's true, and mutations happen randomly, and your brain waves happen randomly, why should I believe anything you say if it's just a random thought? But they won't go to the third entity, and that is information. And today we know a lot more about information. Certainly Darwin didn't know about that, and scientists of the 1800s didn't know about that. We now know the structure of the DNA, and we know that in living organisms, that's where the information is. The only difference between dead material and live material is one thing, and that's information. And in our case, in our bodies, and in all living organisms, that's in the DNA. And it's much more than just information, too. So life is explained by material, matter and energy, and information, which obviously is non-material. And it's non-material. Think of this computer here, this disk. Information in this computer disk is just zeros and ones. But the order of those zeros and ones tells me, how to interpret that information. But there's no weight to that information. Whether it's a 0 or 1 doesn't change the weight. It's not material. In the case of writing, ink is the material that we write with. That is the material, but the ink doesn't contain the information. The information always comes from some intelligent being. I can spill a bottle of ink, but that doesn't tell me, the blot doesn't tell me much. If I take a pen and dip it into that blot and then write something, that tells me something, if I write it in a language that we can all understand. But that is done by an intelligent person. You can't get meaningful letters from that. So information has the following four components: code, meaning, action, and purpose. Let me explain what that is. In terms of biological information, it's the four elements of the base pairs. The A and T go together, and the C and G go together. And all of those base pairs, the order of those base pairs determine what protein you have, what DNA you have, and what program is in your cell. And the words are composed of three of these letters, codons, and the meaning of each of these three-letter words represents one of the 20 amino acids that make up living material. There are thousands of different amino acids. There are left-handed amino acids, there are right-handed amino acids. The only ones that make up living material is 20 specific left-handed amino acids. When Miller ran his experiment, he got both left-handed and right-handed amino acids. That wasn't living material. It's impossible for his experiment to produce that. So that's where the meaning comes from those 20 amino acids. The action, you put them together, you make them a protein. Those amino acids have to be in a very specific row to have a useful protein. And then the purpose of all this, well, reproduction. The program for reproducing every cell is in the program in the cell, which resides in the DNA. So you need a program, you need information, and that's all done by DNA. Complexity of the cell, we've seen pictures like this. You have up to 100 trillion of these cells in your body, in the human genome. And just to describe one of these cells takes thousands of books of an encyclopedia, just one. So going to mathematical probability here, you know how You know, you can flip coins, heads and tails, and yeah, sometimes you can get 3 or 4 in a row, you know, heads. Try and get 4 in a row. Gets more and more difficult. 5. Go up to 10 in a row. The probability of getting 10 in a row is 1 in 10 to the third, and that's 1 in 1,000. If you could take it up to 100 or 1,000 heads in a row, what do you think the probability of doing that? You know, that turns out to be 1 in 10 to the power of 300. That's a huge number. Well, I should say a small number. 1 in over 10 to the power of 300 is a very, very small number. Mathematicians, what do they do with this? What is the probability that life can start by chance? Well, let's look at some numbers. A single protein, you know, one protein, which may have 400 amino acids in it in a very specific order, the probability of getting that by chance is 1 in 10 to the power of 240. 1 with 240 zeros after it. That's a very, very small number. That's just for one protein with 400 acids, amino acids, left-handed at that. And more complex proteins have thousands of different amino acids. Some mathematicians in the UK came up with what's the probability of forming one cell? 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. So just one of these cells. Spontaneous formation of one of these cells by chance, it's not going to happen. There's just no way it can happen by chance. Okay, consider that there's only 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the whole universe that we know. You know, that's a much larger probability than 1 in 10 to the 240th or 1 in 10 to the 40,000. Now, what's mathematically possible? The law of probability, the law of mathematical probability says that anything smaller than 1 in 10 to the power of 50 is just not going to happen. It just, time, it's not long enough, it's just the probability of it happening mathematically impossible. So all of these other, just one protein is impossible, a living cell is impossible, just by mathematical probability. It just can't happen. And this is the quote from that professor who came up with the 40,000 zeros, 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. And he concludes they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. In other words, you can't just form such a living organism by chance. There is some intelligence behind it. You know, you look around the room here, even if you take one of these, you know, one of these stands of iron or a chair, you're not going to say, well, stuff fell from the ceiling and it just formed by chance. That's what happened. And it can happen because there's, you know, there's not many components to that. Well, I would say even that can't happen by chance. And so certainly living organisms are not going to happen by chance. It takes intelligence to design that. So the origin of life, you know, is just impossible to explain mathematically using the components that we know are part of life. Self-replicating organism, not going to happen. So here's two interesting quotes, living matter and information. One is from an evolutionist, Paul Davies. He's an astrobiologist. Here's what he says. It's a shame that there are precious few hard facts when it comes to the origin of life. We have a rough idea when it began on Earth and some interesting theories about where, but the whole how part has everybody stumped. Nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell. They have no answer. When Dawkins is asked, how does information get into a cell? Where does that information come from? He has no explanation, but he believes, he has faith, that science will be able to explain it someday. Just like Darwin had faith that paleontologists would find the evidence in the fossil record for evolution, but they haven't. There's no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. This is a German information scientist, and he's written a number of books on this. The latest book is called No Excuse, very well written. It explains the laws of information, which nobody has refuted, and he explains that the information that we see requires an intelligence behind it to explain it. There's no other explanation. You know, you see it all around you here. All the things you see manufactured by somebody who wrote a design for that, and then the craftsman put that together. And same thing with information. Somebody has to come up with that, the information, and somebody has to put it together. So then the fourth one, and this is also a biggie, and I'm going to explain that. Evolution and the second law of thermodynamics. And you'll find people speaking about this. This is one of the biggies. Second law of thermodynamics says that there's increasing entropy in the universe. In other words, there's more and more unusable energy becoming available in the universe. But it's become more and more useless over time. Evolution, however, and that requires going from order to disorder. I mean, everything around us is disintegrating. Even if everybody vacated this room, and you'd see disintegration happening here all its own over time. You know, your bedroom becomes more disorganized and dirty over time, even if you're not in it. So everything goes from order to disorder. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Evolution, however, requires that we go from disorder. Now, if there really were a big bang first, explosions really don't create order. You don't expect them to. But then everything has to go from simple to complex. Totally the reverse of the second law of thermodynamics. What do we observe in nature? We do observe things going from order to disorder, deterioration, less available energy over time, increased randomness over time. So everything's going to disorder. A little bit more on the second law, and I start with the classical thermodynamics entropy. Energy can never be 100% converted to work, and we know this from experiment. Entropy is the amount of unavailable energy. Over time, there's less and less energy available to do work. And I won't go into this whole conversion process, but you know, mechanical engineers, heat engineers, you know, have gone through this, and they understand that things are running down. There's no such thing as free energy. It just doesn't happen. Even in terms of information, there's informational entropy. Applies to transmission and storage of information. I mean, the information in my disk here, if I did nothing to it, and even if I did something to it, sometimes these disks break down. We lose information. So things run down. And there are no known exceptions to that law, the second law. Isaac Asimov, a very well-known speaker on evolution and an atheist, he said the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. So he agrees that's happening. Second law of thermodynamics is happening. Even if we never enter it, your room here, it becomes dusty and musty. It always gets worse. That's just what the second law is all about. So everything's running down. Scientists agree in that. So if we apply the second law of thermodynamics to evolution, what do we see? Well, supposedly everything started out with a big bang, chaos, disorder, and then we have simple molecules or simple atoms, hydrogen and helium, and then eventually simple molecules. We have the sun and the earth, and then we have a much more complex universe of galaxies, etc. So, well then, let us say, well, that only applies to closed systems. Well, yes and no. Evolutionists will argue that living systems are exceptions because they represent open systems. And yes, we live in an open system. You know, I can walk outside in the daylight here. I'm getting energy from the sun. There's a source of energy. So it's an open system. I'm open to the sun there. Solar energy can be and is added to the earth when the sun shines. Even when it doesn't shine, it shines through the clouds. But second law applies to the whole universe. Entropy is increasing in the whole universe. Things become less organized, less complex, more random in the universe. Raw solar energy increases entropy. Heat, for example. You know, if I put a piece of iron out on the tarmac there and the sun shines, what's going to happen to that shiny iron? It's not going to get shinier. It's going to start to rust. It's deteriorating. That energy is coming to the iron, but it's deteriorating the iron. It's not giving it more energy. So here comes a quote from John Ross, who is a scientist, a chemical engineer, and he agrees there are no known violations of the law of thermodynamics. Ordinarily, the second law is stated for isolated systems, that closed system, but the second law applies equally well to open systems. They're somehow associated with the field of far-off equilibrium phenomena, the notion that the second law of thermodynamics fails for such systems. It's important to make sure that this error does not perpetuate itself. So here's a secular scientist agreeing that it does apply to open systems. And I think you can see it through this explanation here. So you start with an open system and an energy supply. You go out in the tarmac, you've got an open system, you've got an energy supply from the sun. However, just having a source of energy there doesn't make anything grow or get better or get more shiny. What they forget is that for something to get more complex, like living material, you've got to give it energy, but that energy has to be converted to a mechanism to grow the complexity. And where does that come from? Well, there's a program. There's a program built into living organisms. For plants, it's photosynthesis. If there weren't a program of photosynthesis in that plant, shining the sun on that would do nothing for it. There has to be some way to capture that energy, store it, and convert that into something that can make that plant grow. So examples of that, of course, is the plant that I show here. Photosynthesis is working. Sun's energy converts it through the program into proteins, turning a seed into a plant. How does a seed know how to grow into a plant? How does an acorn seed know how to grow an acorn tree? Well, and not a cherry tree? Well, because the program to build an acorn tree is built into that seed. And so when it gets some energy, there's a program acting on it, and it grows the right kind of plant. Animal metabolism. How do you stay alive? How do you grow? There's a metabolism within our living organisms that knows what to do with food that's taken in and converted to our cells, and our cells feed off of that. But the point is, you have to have a program with information, and you have to have a mechanism for storing the energy that comes into that program. So living systems have a program, and that is in the DNA, the code, which I showed you before. That directs the process of the organism to build it. The process continues throughout life of the organism faster than natural processes can break it down. So again, that program is important. Second thing, the living organism has a storage conversion mechanism. So the way to convert that energy into storage and do the conversion so the program can use it, animals use the metabolism to grow and continue that living organism alive. Well, some people will say, well, what about, I see salt crystals, sodium and chloride. There's a regular structure. There's an order there. That just happened by chance. I didn't see anybody putting that salt crystal together by hand. There wasn't no intelligence behind that. So obviously this can happen by chance. Well, no, there's a difference between order and organized complexity. What you see in the salt crystal is order. In other words, there's an attraction between those two ions, the salt and the sodium and the chloride, which knows how to pull it in to a salt crystal. That's its resting energy, if you will. So that's built into those ions. However, organized systems have to be organized by some intelligence. There has to be some program to put that together. And so that's the difference between order and organized systems. So we need to understand that distinction. So examples of order in nature, well, I mentioned the crystals, salt crystals and other crystals, snowflakes. Yeah, they're sort of random, but they're snow. flakes, and there's a certain way that those particles attract each other. So there's no intelligent program required. The mechanism is built into those components. However, organized complexity exists in life. All living things, even single-celled organisms, each functioning according to the programs that are embedded in those materials. So spontaneous generation, as I said before, has been disproved by scientists and has never been shown to happen in nature even now. I believe somebody has $1 million prize out. If you can show me a mechanism that works that way, here's $1 million. Nobody has claimed it yet and are unlikely to claim it because these scientists have shown that's impossible. So that's a challenge posed by the second law. So in summary, I'll say evolution is only a theory. Some would say, well, it's not even a theory because it can't be falsified. It hasn't been proven. All these 4 things that I showed you, they disprove evolution. Evolution, macroevolution is what we're talking about here, cannot happen by chance. All these 4 pieces of evidence that evolution is used, there's no science behind it. It just doesn't happen. And here's the definition they used. Here's another common definition: a continuous naturalistic mechanism process by which all living things have arisen from a single living source, which itself arose by a similar process from a non-living, inanimate world. So somehow it have to start from non-living material and then gain this randomly produce a living organism, a living cell, and then reproduce from there. A theory, but any good theory, and that's only a theory, and I say this is not even a good theory, it's better called a scientific hypothesis. It's a guess, conjecture. A good theory implies that it has self-consistency, it applies agreement with observations, and it applies a useful nature. So if you look at that from those 3 perspectives, evolution is not self-consistent. Because remember that one of the first slides I showed, 5 different definitions of evolution, that's not consistent. We can only talk about macroevolution when we talk about evolution. All these other 4, they don't fit this at all. So evolution is not self-consistent. In the varied contradictory camps connected with thermodynamics, as you saw, phylogeny, the fossil record, proposed mechanisms, and various sub-theories, none of it hangs together. There's not a good story. And if you look at that DVD, Evolution's Achilles Heels, you'll see that these 9 scientists put together a story which corroborate what I'm saying here. There's no scientific explanation for evolution. Evolution doesn't agree with observations, and I've only covered a few of these here. I covered the fossil record, genetics, molecular biology, thermodynamics, and probability mathematics. But if you look at the other pieces that secular scientists use to prove that evolution is true, they don't hold water either. But I picked the 4 that I've worked with for the last number of years, and these, I think, are some of the 4 strongest arguments against macroevolution. Is it useful? Well, no. No new advancements in scientific knowledge or technology or science requires belief in evolution. There are biologists who say that biology makes no sense without evolution. Well, I would say biology makes no sense with evolution because you can't explain it with evolution. It just doesn't work. So it doesn't require belief in evolution. In fact, in some cases, science or evolution has held up science. Remember when the early biologists came out with the junk DNA? They said most of the DNA that we see in the living organism is junk. 2% codes for proteins, all the rest is left over from evolution. So they didn't even consider it. And even Dawkins said it's junk DNA up until about 2000 early 2000s. But now even he has to admit he can't call it junk DNA because all that DNA has a purpose. There's no advancement in medicine, hindered in some cases because of false claims. You remember the argument of vestigial organs that scientists had. They had about a list of 150 vestigial organs, your appendix, your tonsils, and et cetera, 150 of them. Well, it turns out each one of them has a function. They said they were left over from evolution. They have no useful purpose. That's dead weight. No, they have a purpose. There's no positive contribution to society through evolution-based social scientists. Yeah, I do a talk on the impact of evolution on ethics, and the record in the last century has been terrible, as you know. You can look at what Hitler did, what Stalin did, and all these dictators of the 20th century. They killed tens of million people, not just from other countries, but also of their own, because they're trying to help evolution along. So evolution is at the root of many of the happenings of the last century, bad happenings. So, moreover, evolution can't be proved. You can't use a scientific method on it because if it were true, it's happening so slowly that you can't measure it. However, we have plenty of evidence left behind which show that evolution just cannot happen. And these are just two scientists who are evolutionists. They agree that we can't measure it, use a scientific method. So evolutionism is found wanting. It was evolution, that is macroevolution, has never been observed. There are no credible transitional fossils that can show evolution. Life cannot, did not, and I would say will not originate from non-life. It just can't happen, because then you have to explain where did the information come from that builds life. And then evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics. So with that, I'm going to bring it to a close. Those are four biggies. And I challenge anybody to find a hole in the arguments there. You'll see a quote from evolutionists, when they're asked the question, well, where does the information come from in living organisms? Well, they can't explain it. Dawkins cannot explain it. And all four of these, cannot be explained by the evolution at all. So let me bring Chris back up, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to open it up for some question and answers. We're going to take a brief offering. So if you're prepared to give tonight, I'll give you a moment to make preparations. You can use the envelopes that are in the seat back. All of the offering that's taken up is turned over to Cedar Park and is earmarked for this specific program. So help us out if you can. Ron and Carl, if you guys want to come on down. So, you said that evolution wasn't even really a theory, but more a hypothesis, but they teach it as like absolute fact these days in schools. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just absolute fact.
Yeah, just to answer that, I had another slide.
Carl, why don't you come down and help him?
I had another slide.
Ron, hang on just a second. I'm gonna pray for us just briefly.
Yeah, I was just going to say another slide which showed the grade from a fact, which every scientist, every person agrees that it's true, all the way down to a hypothesis, theory, and in between.
So it's like a fact and a theory, fact and a hypothesis.
Yeah.
So it's fact that it's happened, but hypothetical how it happened.
Yeah.
It's like they turn the whole scientific method on its head. They just assume it's a fact, and then we'll work on the hypothesis and theory on how it happened, I guess, at some later point in time. Yeah. That's great. So every month we'll bring a bunch of resources with us that are specific for this topic. So back there close to the door on one of those tables, you find a whole bunch of books and DVDs that are specifically on evolution and Darwinism. So feel free to take a look at those on your way out. Let me offer up the offering and word prayer. Father, we just wanted to lift up the monies that are given this evening for your good work. Father, we'd ask that those monies would help us expand the word of your gospel, the word of your creation, Father, that we will it'll help us to deliver this and send out this message to the ends of the earth, Father. We just ask that you bless these monies, that you bless this program, Father. We'd ask that you bless Cedar Park Church. Father, we lift these monies up to you this evening, Father. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, thanks, guys. So we're going to open this up for some question and answers. And Dr. Lick Lama, I'm sure, can answer anything evolution related. PhD in nuclear physics, so I think that means you know everything, close to everything. Okay, so if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll come around. Back over here. Hang on just a second. Let me get the mic on you. Oh, he's asking what the frog is saying up there in your cartoon. Oh. Was that your only question? Did you make me walk all the way over here for that?
The frog is saying, well, my wife left me for a prince. Said she'd kissed enough of my kind. It goes back to this one where, the Frog Prince book. If somebody says if a frog turns into a prince instantaneously, that's a fairy tale. However, a frog in over 300 million years turns into a prince, that's science. So I was just saying, my wife has had enough of these princes.
Let's see, if it's a hypothesis, then could you also describe the process?
You're going to have to speak a little louder.
If it's a hypothesis, then would this be a process that you could just say is a vector?
I mean, calling evolution and a hypothesis is the right thing to do. It's a conjecture, right? Where a theory, to be called a theory, you really have to be able to falsify the theory or verify it. And you can't do that with this. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, Dawkins takes it all the way. He says, consider evolution a fact, which there's no basis for that statement.
I guess this is a two-parter. If there was these evolutionary links in our fossil record, you would think that there would be more than just, part of a coffin full of evidence. You think that this would be abundant and obvious, just as seeing humanity back into our own fossil record, we can see humans, many tons all over the place. So I was curious as to if it isn't as obvious it seems as it should be, why do you think do so many people all over the world try with sometimes their entire careers to do nothing but prove evolution is?
So the question is, why don't we find more transitional fossils that...
Yeah, you would think that there would be many. There wouldn't just be like 3 or 4 or 5 in the entire world.
Yeah. Yeah, like I showed in the case of ape-like to man, I showed 6 examples. There are a few more. Actually, the last few years, there are a few that made the front page of the newspaper. Ida, was one of them, and there's a bunch of others too. But they have already been debunked. They realize they can't be real. And why don't we find more? Is the question.
The big question is kind of an opinion. The big question is kind of an opinion of yours because you've dealt with a lot of this matter as to why do people try and go to such great extents to falsify evidence, to create stuff out of thin air? Why are people so hung up in needing to prove evolution is really what happened?
Well, I would say in the case of the fossil record, Darwin knew he didn't have the fossil evidence, but he figured over time paleontologists would find more fossils which would show it. And even evolutionists today, paleontologists today, are looking for more examples. If an ape-like creature really evolved into a man, there should be some record, and you can put it together. But there is none. I mean, there's so few that are reported. They don't come every day. And part of it is people will say, well, man, if it happens catastrophically, fossils are created catastrophically. I mean, it has to die and be buried, else the vultures will eat it. So man, with his wits about him, can escape a lot of that. So you're going to find not as many fossils of humans as, say, of some other animals.
I guess it's kind of a complex question, I guess. Is what would you believe the drive in a human being to prove evolution? What is it? Is it people are scared without evolution? They're worried in their everyday lives. They don't understand, because like I was saying, there's so many people, like you were talking about, that have been debunked, that they have spent a large part of their whole entire scientific career trying to prove evolution. What is in it then people that drives a number of people in our world to feel that it's inherently necessary for them to prove evolution? Why is it without evolution people feel so incredibly lost?
Yeah. I would say one thing is that they don't like the alternative. Because if evolution is not true, then what is? And, I would say creation. I mean, there's a designer behind what we see. And they don't want to accept that, because then they have to be accountable to whoever created them. They don't like that answer. So that's why they're looking so hard. That's one reason. Second reason is fame. These paleontologists, why would the person that found the Lucy fossil have to go to two different places, which are miles apart, to get something that they can make look like what they expected to find? Yeah.
I mean, everyone wants the world to make sense to them.
Yep.
I think this is a lot of the drive behind trying to prove this. If a person has rejected the existence of God, to make sense of the world they live in, something like evolution must be responsible. Mm-hmm. And so for the world to make sense to them, they have to search, diligently for that evidence for the world then to make sense. Yeah. It's the only way it will. If you've rejected God, the only way the world's going to make sense is if you can find the mechanism through which we came to be here, without a creation, without a God. So it's everyone needs the world to make sense, and you're going to either accept it by faith or work diligently to try to come up with your own proofs. Do we have another question? Right back here.
You touched briefly on Neanderthals, and recently in the news they've been talking about how we modern humans are a certain percentage Neanderthal, and that they claim to have found places where Neanderthals and modern humans intermixed and interbred. What's your take on that?
My opinion is that most scientists now believe that the Neanderthal is really like a human. It walked upright, but it had some bone deficiency, some bone disease, and so they may have been tilted over a little bit. In fact, there's a place in Croatia that has a museum for the Neanderthal man, and my wife and I we go to Croatia and speak there sometimes, and went to see that museum. So it was interesting. But there are hundreds of records of Neanderthal man within Europe that they found, and if you look at them carefully, they're really like human beings. Yeah.
Our cameraman has a question over here.
So, Heinz, when you had the slide about that one scientist, and he was saying the primary axiom, I didn't understand that term.
Yeah, by the primary axiom, he really meant the theory of evolution, which consists of the mutations, natural selection, and common descent. Those three aspects of evolution. Yeah, primary axiom, and Dr. Sanford has shown that can't be true. Yeah.
Do we have another question? Okay, Dr. Leklama, I'm going to have you close us out in a word of prayer. Real briefly, there are some posters in the back for the symposium next month. We obviously need help with promotion, if you can get some posters and pin them up at Fred Meyer or the libraries like I do, or when you see the emails go out from the Northwest Creation News, forward those on to your friends. I'm going to try each month to bring in a book, just some book that I consider to be very important, that we're just going to offer at cost, whatever our cost is. So this will be a regular practice of ours. And I brought in the War of the Worldviews. This has been authored by several different authors. It was a collaborative project. Very, very important content in this. And so we just made this available at our cost. You can get that from Ron back there in the back. Don't forget to sign up for the email list if you haven't already. And there's also some free stuff in the back. So I'm going to just keep bringing in just some free stuff. So there's some old VHSs and you can feel comfortable for future meetings to bring, if you're like me, once I read a book, usually that's it. It has to be a really important book for me to ever go back into it. And so if you have creation, or Christian apologetics resources that you want to just give away, you can bring those and put those back there with the free stuff that's back there too. Or again, if in future months, if you hear news of some creation program coming up, bring that with you so I can announce it. Or if you find any other news related items like the two that I read at the beginning of the program, bring those in and I'll either pass the mic to you and you can talk about that at the beginning of the program, or pass it off to me if you're not really comfortable getting up in front like some people are. All right? Good? Last call for a question for Dr. Liklama. All right, Heinz, if you close us out in a word of prayer. I think your mic's...
Father, we just come to you just to thank you for this program. Thank you for the organization that Chris and others put into it. And we just pray that your word would go forth from here. We just thank you for the evidence that you have left for your truth, your scriptures, and the evidence in various areas that, and we have faith in that. And we just pray that this message would get out to others too, and that they would consider what we have to say and come to a saving knowledge of you. We just thank you for this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.